Good evening, Green Tree. Welcome back to week 3 of The Way. If you've missed our first couple of videos in this series, I would encourage you to go back and watch them. You don't have to do it right now. You can watch this one before you go back and watch them. But just know that there's some good stuff in there. So there's some great interviews I want you to listen to. So go back and give those a listen if you haven't gotten the chance to yet. I'm going to start things off tonight a little bit different than I normally do with a personal story, and then I'm going to dive into our text for the evening. We're going to walk alongside Paul as he goes through one of the more difficult parts of his ministry experience, and that's saying something considering that it's Paul. He had a lot of difficult parts of his experience, but this is one of the most difficult. With that being said, again, we're going to be skipping a ton of really awesome stuff, and not just the book of Acts this week, but in some of Paul's letters. And I would encourage you, again, if you don't have a book that you're currently reading in the Bible, to take those books and make those the ones that you're reading, especially if you're interested right now in learning more and more about the early church, because I can give you snapshots with these 4 weeks that we're going to have, but I'm never going to be able to fully capture what those books have in store for you. So go ahead and dive into those letters, give them a chance, read them, start to understand them. The wisdom that is contained within their pages is so relevant to us right now, and I would love to see you guys diving into those. I'm also really looking forward to my interview tonight with a woman from our church who I highly respect and value, but we'll save that a little bit for later. So, like I said a minute ago, I wanted to start off tonight talking about a personal story from my time in ministry before coming to Green Tree. Over the course of my college experience, the 4 years I was in college, I had multiple internship opportunities that I took advantage of. I volunteered at several youth groups, and I even worked at camp for a summer. So in those 4 years, I would say that I probably packed in more ministry experience than most of my peers around me, although I will admit that my wife actually had a tad bit more ministry experience than me over the course of the 4 years. But far and away, the largest chunk of that ministry experience was with the Quest program at Lincoln Christian Church. And I started volunteering with Quest my second semester, my freshman year, and I continued volunteering with Quest all the way through sophomore year, and then my junior and senior year, I actually got the opportunity to be brought on staff at Lincoln Christian Church as a youth ministry associate, and I was actually in charge of the Quest 6-8 and Quest 9-12 programs, working with junior high and high school students. And Quest is an interesting ministry because it's different than most of the other youth ministries out there. It's actually intentionally designed to target unchurched kids, as opposed to like bring in the kids from around the community. These kids are students who, for the most part, have never been through the doors of the church other than at Quest. And I absolutely love my time with the Quest program. I credit that time with probably being the most formative for how I do ministry today. But with that being said, it was difficult ministry. Not just because as associates we worked way more hours than we ever got paid for. That's just kind of the nature of the job. But more than that, unchurched kids are oftentimes kids who've experienced a lot of pain from a lot of different people in their lives. And some of my students had dealt with more pain by 13 than I think I'll probably ever deal with in my life. And in that ministry, it's always helpful to remember that hurt people, and that's especially true when it's hurt kids, because they kind of do it without ever knowing that they're actually causing other people pain. And I have thick skin. I've endured plenty of insults thrown my way over the course of my time there. But there was one point where I was kind of ready to be done. I had some solid kids that disappointed me in a kind of big way. And I was ready to walk away. And I went to my boss, Zach Ramsey, who was then and still is a fantastic team leader. And I told him how I was feeling. And he said, "Brendan, ministry is like baseball." And I was like, "Okay, that's cool. I hate baseball, so I'm going to quit, go home." And he was like, "No. Just hang on a minute, okay?" And he explained to me that in baseball, you can't always try to hit home runs. You're not going to hit every ball out of the park. Sometimes you just need to get on base. And if you're batting .300, you're doing fine. Sometimes you might be expecting a fastball down the middle, and bam, you get a curve. So what do you do then? You keep swinging. And I've reminded myself of that conversation a ton since it happened a few years ago, and more so lately with all the sudden changes that have been going on. It's a valuable simile, but it's even more valuable when you pull the curtain back a little bit on the individual that was giving it to me. Zach, my boss, has struggled for most of his life with depression at different times, and he's gone through some serious darkness. And in the midst of the darkness, he has learned to lean into God and into others, including his parents, his mentors, doctors, therapists, and friends. and he's learned to emerge from the darkness each time a deeper and wiser man because he knows how to mediate it now. And he continues to this day to not quit, even when he strikes out. And there's been times in his ministry experience where he has. He gets back in the box, and he keeps swinging. Paul experienced similar darkness at different points in his life, and one of those times was during the latter half of his time with the church at Ephesus. And before we go on, I want us to keep a couple of questions in mind. The first one is what does discipleship look like in the dark night? What does discipleship look like in the dark night? In other words, how do we grow closer to God and closer together in the midst of unpredictable, painful experiences? Luke records the story of Paul's time in Ephesus in Acts 19 through 20, and it's a good place for us to start kind of diving into the backstory of what leads to some really painful experiences in Paul's life that ultimately changed the way that he teaches and the way that he lives his life. And starting at the beginning of chapter 19, we read that Paul first encountered some of the Jews who had been baptized by John the Baptist years prior when he first gets to Ephesus, and he tells them about Jesus being the one who John was proclaiming was going to come. And just like that, Paul has his first converts in Ephesus. And from there, he kind of goes his normal route of going to the synagogue, speaking to the Jewish individuals there, telling them the good news of the gospel. And he finds some success there, but he's kind of pushed out because they're like, hey, this guy's kind of causing a little bit of trouble. They push him out, and he goes to his normal job of being a tent maker. And it's in his workshops in the city center where he's continuing to proclaim the gospel, and he's finding huge success as God is using him to do some pretty incredible things, even to the point of doing miraculous things. And such things are kind of necessary in a city like Ephesus, where you've got the imperial cult, and you've got the great temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and you've got these magicians who are practicing all kinds of dark arts throughout the city. So it's even more impressive when those magicians are actually some of the converts, and they burn their books that they use to practice these dark arts, and they convert to spreading the gospel themselves. Paul found great success in Ephesus, and it even poured over into the surrounding regions in cities like Laodicea and Colossae. And this is a big reason why he stays there for what ends up being close to 3 years, between 53 and 56 AD. The exceptions to that stay are a trip to Jerusalem and then another trip most likely to Corinth, where Paul had established a church already, only to receive news, kind of bad news, of them potentially rejecting him as a leader. And the trip to Jerusalem gives Paul this idea to start fundraising from the churches that have been established in the area of Asia, and then return to Jerusalem to bring that fundraising to them. But when he gets back to Ephesus, there's a riot going on. Let's pick up in verse 23. About that time, there arose a great disturbance about the way. A silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought in a lot of business for the craftsmen there. He called them together along with the workers in related trades and said, "You know, my friends, that we receive a good income from this business. And you see and hear how this fellow Paul has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus and in practically the whole province of Asia. He says that gods made by human hands are no gods at all. There is danger not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited, and the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty." And when they heard this, they were furious and began shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!" And soon the whole city was in uproar. The people seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia, and all of them rushed into the theater together. And Paul wanted to appear before the crowd, but the disciples would not let him. Even some of the officials of the province, friends of Paul, sent him a message begging him not to venture into the theater. So Paul comes back, and here is this riot, and he's at the heart of it. He understands that, and he wants to go and speak to these people, probably use it as an opportunity like he has elsewhere to proclaim the gospel in front of all of these people, but his friends won't let him, because they're afraid that if he goes, he's going to lose his life. And eventually, at the end of the chapter, the riot is quenched, and without harm to Paul or any members of the way, but the damage was done. The Ephesus that Paul returned to was not the one that he left. And when he goes to Corinth, in the early part of chapter 20, it's with fundraising in mind, but he's rejected there, like we said earlier, by some of the leaders in the Corinthian church, a church that he helped establish. So far, he's come back to Ephesus and seen a riot. and then he's gone to Corinth and been rejected. But it doesn't really stop there. When he goes back to Ephesus again, many scholars believe that this is the point in time where he's thrown in prison. He's probably propped up by false charges against him, charges of inciting a riot, and he's thrown in prison. And it's one of the more painful prison experiences that he has. So in a relatively short time of 3 months, Paul went from essentially the high point of his ministry, like things are going incredibly well, to the point that he's like, hey, these churches are doing so good, I bet we could fundraise for the church in Jerusalem. That's a big change from what we studied 3 weeks ago. And he goes from that high point to one of the lowest points that he would ever reach in his ministry experience, from evil, painful, unpredictable things that were out of his control. To get a glimpse of how Paul felt at this time, it's worth looking at 2 Corinthians. Paul most likely wrote 2 Corinthians upon his release from this stay in prison, and not like a long time later, like almost immediately upon his release from prison. And with that hindsight of that experience being in the past behind him, he penned these words starting in 1:8. We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we had received the sentence of death, but this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. It's clear here that Paul was most likely suffering from some form of depression himself. If our own friends were to use this kind of language talking to us, we would probably recommend that they go see a doctor or help them find a therapist that they can talk to. And that's not a bad thing. I'm not creating a stigma about that. But that's what we would do if we saw it. He despaired of life itself. He no longer wanted to live. He could look back after and see that he was meant to rely on God in this experience. But in the midst of the dark place, in the midst of that bad experience, he was really hurting. He was really hurting, experiencing physical, social, spiritual, psychological pain. And that becomes more clear continuing on in the letter. Let's take a look at this passage from 4, 8, and 9. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. Here's the thing. Before there was a not in this passage, in the midst of the dark night, there was only pressure from every side. There was only the feeling of being crushed, the feeling of being confused, the feeling of being persecuted, of being struck down. And if we're being honest with ourselves, I think that most of us have experienced that place in our lives. I know that I have. I talked about one of those experiences earlier, but it's not the only time I've experienced a place like that. I think the dark night is something that comes and goes. And lately, if I'm being honest again, it's been doing more coming than going. I feel like we've been in the dark night for a while. So what do? I think we should take a look at what Paul did. I'm under the impression first that he prayed a ton. For Paul, it kind of always starts there in this direct conversation that he's having with God. And then he talked to those immediately around him, not just the people who were sharing in his suffering in prison, but those who would come and visit him. And then he wrote, in this case, 4 letters, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon, to address specific local church issues. And then lastly, Ephesians, to send out a letter to be circulated amongst all the churches in the region. There's a ton of evidence to suggest that Ephesians was a circular letter. Some of the strongest is that the oldest, most reliable manuscripts we have, they don't have an address. There is no to the church at Ephesus. There's also no real formal greeting like we would normally get with a Paul letter if he's specifically addressing one audience. And Colossians tells us of a circular letter being passed through the region. And because Ephesus is kind of the hub, that is a good basis for thinking that it would be sent out from there. So what is Paul's purpose in writing a circular letter in the midst of this incredibly difficult time in his own life? I think that it's to talk about those moments. What do we do in those moments. He's sitting in prison. Everybody he's writing to knows that he's there. And they're wondering, Paul, what are you going to do? And so he spends the first 3 chapters explaining that faith in Christ is built on resting in his power and pulling strength from him, and then having unity with one another despite anything that would normally separate us from each other. In other words, faith is built on growing closer to God and closer together. And in the middle of the dark night, it's those things that are going to pull you through. In chapter 4, the tone of the letter kind of switches from this rich theological language that he's using to build up his position, his argument that he's making, to really practical language. How do we take this argument and put it into action in our lives? And it's chapter 4, 11 through 16, I would like for us to look at as we wind down our teaching portion and lead into the interview. I think this is one of the strongest pieces of Paul's writing, one of the most impactful personally for me in my own experience. So let's take a look at it. So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers to equip his people for works of service so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Then we will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of people and their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. From him, the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work. This is what the Christian life is all about. Right there. This is what discipleship is all about. We're not all called to the same roles in life. In fact, the opposite is true. We're all equipped in different ways. But we all are called to come together in unity and knowledge of the Son of God. And it's in that practice that as the dark night returns, we grow stronger in our fight against it. We become mature. We are shaken and broken less and less by the experiences that go on around us. And I'm not saying that just relying on God and other people is the only way. If you have like a chemical imbalance in your brain or something, please find help, take medicine, see a therapist. But it's those relationships. It's growing closer to God and growing closer together that are going to mature you in your faith in those experiences. And I don't know about you, but I am so incredibly grateful that that passage is the truth. And I'm proof of it. In my experiences, I've proved that passage to myself. And it's moments like I had with Zach, where he told me ministry is like baseball. It's those moments I have in the dark night where I'm leaning into the relationships that I have built up, not just with God, but also with other people that get me through. It's the relationships and the depth of understanding God that continue to grow when we remember to keep swinging. Our interview tonight is with a woman who has been a part of this church for many years. She is a wife, a mom, and an educator whose oldest daughter actually served at Quest right alongside me. So if Hannah ever sees this, she knows who I'm talking about. Thank you for doing this, and welcome, Stephanie.
Oh, you're welcome.
So I think most people in all of Raleigh probably recognize who you are, but just in case someone watching this doesn't know who you are, why don't you start off with telling us a little bit about yourself, about your family, and about what you do for a living.
Okay. Well, we came to Raleigh in 1996, married to Jim.
That was the year I was born.
You don't have to say that. So, we've come to church here ever since we moved here. Started in the praise band here as well, and started teaching and coaching when we moved here. And then I stayed home with our kids. We have 6 kids, and became a nurse in the middle of all that, and went to Phelps Health and worked there for about 5 years. And then 7 years ago, went back to the school system at Raleigh Technical Center, teaching a health science class there for seniors in high school.
Yeah, nice. So I kind of wanted to touch base a little bit early on about how your life changed with COVID, because I think that's kind of the underlying dark night that's really affecting all of us.
It really is.
So what has your experience been like through all this, not just as an educator, but also like as a mother, and how has your involvement in discipleship here at Green Tree during that time kind of helped you through that experience?
Well, so when COVID hit, I had just gone up to see Hannah, and I had come back, and they shut everything in Illinois down the next day. So I was really glad I got to go see her before everything kind of really hit the fan. But then that week, school closed down here. And in my class in particular, they were in a clinical setting. They were going to their clinical sites, and then all their clinical sites started saying, no, you can't come.
Yeah.
And it was right in the middle of their testing period when we were trying to get ready for them to test for their certification for CNA. So it pretty much threw a wrench into everything. I have all seniors, so they weren't going to, like, graduation was up in the air. Their testing for my class that they've been doing things for 2 years for was up in the air. Everything was just completely unknown. It took them out of their normal everything. And luckily, we were able to get that done, their CNA, and they did graduate finally, too. But it really threw a wrench into everything. And then my college student came home, and all my kids were home, and we were working from home.
Yeah.
So it was interesting.
You can
to
only
say
play
the
so
least.
many games of living room basketball. Right?
Yes, we had a basketball goal in our living room. It's still there. We haven't played it for a while, but it's been warm, so everybody's been outside. So as far as discipleship goes, that kind of had a wrench thrown into it too, a little bit. We couldn't really get together, or we didn't. And then we started doing parking lot small group, where we would come out here in the parking lot and social distance and just sit in a big circle and talk to each other, which was just fabulous because we had adult interaction and we could talk about what was going on. And personally, I've always tried to get up in the morning and read and pray and just kind of focus my day. And this has given me great opportunity to go deeper. I don't have to only have this many minutes or, whatever to do it. It's pretty much open-ended, and that's been awesome. So
great. I've had a pretty similar experience to that. After Lincoln was born, I had so much time off that it was like, what do I do with all this time that I'm spending at my house? And so the answer is, of course, like, just dive deeper, go deep. And that's actually where I kind of worked through planning some of this out. So similar experience there.
Right.
What is another dark night experience that you've gone through? And how was your faith kind of developed through that period?
Well, I'm kind of at the top of the hill now in my age range, as you alluded to, being so young. But I've been a Christian since I was 7, and I've always known what I needed to do to be close to God and things like that. But being a Christian doesn't mean you always make the best choices. And probably my darkest night ever was about a 2-year period of time, my senior year of college, and the next year after that, where I made some really, really boneheaded decisions, bad decisions in my life that did negatively affect my life, but could have really negatively affected my life forever if God hadn't given me a way out of that. And so that dark night experience has colored all the rest of my life because my faith during that time grew so much. And so basically what happened was I met a guy when I was a senior in college, and I met him at church. So, that's great. And I met this guy, and in my plan, it seemed like everything was wonderful. And I just fell head over heels for this guy. And basically, we ended up getting engaged, and it became very apparent that he was super jealous and really controlling, and I had, to prove myself over and over, I love you, and, I don't know why you feel like this. And
pleasing the male ego is it?
Probably about a month before we eventually got married was the first time that he physically hit me. Yeah. And from then on, for the next year, we got married not too long after that. That just got a lot worse. Yeah. Until God gave me a way of escape, which, I look at this all now and it's almost like I'm talking about somebody else's life. Like that wasn't really my life. But it was my life. Yeah. And I remember, even during that time, I still was like, God, I'm so sorry I did this. I blamed myself all the time. And I made my bed, I got to lie in it, type thing. And I was isolated. I was isolated from being able to be in fellowship with people. Yeah. And so really I only had God at that point to be able just to say, help me. I don't know what can happen here. And it was through someone else coming, through me being able to get to somebody else and say, what do? I feel like I have to do this. I'm not going to get divorced. This is not what I do. And they led me into a little bit better understanding of what God wanted and what his word says. And I was able then to get out of that situation through a series of things that happened. And I remember probably the hardest part of everything was after kind of getting myself out of that situation. In my relationship with Christ, I didn't deserve anything. I felt completely damaged and completely at fault, and I had done things I knew I wasn't supposed to do. And I just remember sitting, getting around people that could pour into me a little bit, but even still, those people couldn't fill
it's not, yeah, they can't go all the way because it's...
So I just remember I really got into scripture, and I got into reading a little thing I remember my grandma gave me, and it had scriptures that just said who I was to God. And I'll never forget that. As I continued to read those things daily, I would just say those things and I would read those, that my heart began to soften. And I remember one day sitting on my back deck and I was playing my guitar and singing a little bit, and I just was like, I don't know how you could ever love me. Like, I don't understand how you could ever love me. I have just disappointed you so much. And it was the most audible voice I'd ever had come to me, of God just saying, I really just can't believe you just said that. Basically it was just like, I can't believe you would say I don't love you when I gave everything for you. Yeah. And that changed everything. From that moment on, it was like that Paul experience of like, almost like seeing the light and going, oh my goodness, I have been thinking about this all wrong, and you do love me so much. So now what do I do? Yeah. And then getting into the word, and just God led me to this place where I was like, I don't need anybody. I am just, yours.
Yeah, and then you met Jim.
And then I did meet Jim, which was incredible because it was a few months after that I was just in a place where I was like, I don't need a person to give me my worth. And I did meet Jim at that point. And
God has a way of going, that's good. Here you go.
Right. And it was a hard time even when we began dating because I had a lot of hurts and a lot of things that we had to work through because I was so still in that I'm not really worth this. I'm not really, and, but I remember at that time, it was probably the most definite time I was like, God really loves me. Like, he's not going to stop loving me. And that has colored every other dark night experience
Yeah.
in our lives from that point, because I know without a shadow of a doubt that he loves me no matter what. No matter what I do, no matter what my kids do, no matter what Jim does, no matter, deaths, no matter what, he loves me.
Yeah. I think it's always easy to look with hindsight and say, like, hey, look how this has shaped the way I care about discipleship and everything now. But I know in the midst of it, like leaning into those scriptures and having those kind of just fill your heart and move you forward, even when it feels like you have nothing left to give. Those are the kind of experiences that I think not just Paul, but Christ himself guides us into those experiences. So
Yes.
I'm glad that you've had such a formative one. And I'm glad you got out of that situation when you did.
Yes, for sure.
Because I like your kids. They're pretty cool. How valuable here at your church has your small group or your Sunday school experience been for you in the midst of those dark nights that you've gone through since then?
I think the biggest thing is that small group, especially, we've been involved in small groups since they started here. And we've been in different small groups. You always see and find out that people are just like you.
Yeah.
That people are broken, that people are needing God.
Yeah.
Even if we're Christians, even if we can't just say I'm a Christian, go on. We need God daily. And so our small group experience has shown me that over and over. And people have offered insight in times when we're hurting, and we've been able to offer insight when other people are hurting. And it's been good,
Yeah.
And then Sunday school, I think, is great because maybe those people aren't in your small group, but you still see and hear their perspective on the scripture we're talking about.
Yeah.
And it brings their life experience into it. And so there's been some really cool things happen in our Sunday school classes when I just will go home and be like, wow, I didn't know that, about this person.
Yeah.
Or wow, that's a new way for me to think about that scripture that I haven't thought about
That's
before.
my favorite thing about it is that when you're in the midst of these discussions, you can see the way that other people have processed through things, and it's like, well, I should try that out. Like, let's see if I process through it this
Right.
way, what conclusions am I drawing?
Right.
That's my favorite thing.
Yeah.
I love just learning the different learning styles there. What portion of what you've learned in those moments? This is the hardest question. Okay. What portion of what you've learned in those moments have you made a point of trying to teach your kids?
Oh, good grief. Raising kids is not for the faint of heart.
I'm discovering that. I've recently discovered that.
Wow. I think every situation that we've gone through, we've been able to, at some point, pull something out for one or more or all of our kids.
Yeah.
And either explain to them, tell them, and explain the character of God through what we've lived.
Yeah.
And I know for myself, at 13, I set each one of our kids down and individually and told them my story.
Yeah.
And I picked 13 because that was the time I knew that they were even more interested in other boys and girls and getting into dating and, things like that. And I wanted them to understand that even though I was a Christian, I made some really dumb mistakes because I was of other things that had happened in my life, but because I just took my eyes off where it needed to be. And so that's one of our big teaching things because we're very relational people.
Mm-hmm.
And we all are relational people, and it's easy to get sidetracked by what we hear and see. And sometimes all those opinions and everything else get louder than God's voice. And that's through his word. That's through us spending time with him. And I wanted them to know I really made a mistake because I wasn't listening to God's voice. I was going with my plan and what I thought was supposed to happen and my own way. And so that has been a big one. that we've been able to go back on. And then, of course, you know, we've gone through all kinds of things, you know, in our lives that we've been able to just pull little things out. And when it seems like the time is right, we can say, I've been there, you know, like you're not in this alone, and God does care. And we know how you feel, even though you may not think we know how you feel, we know how you feel.
There's a certain level of actual love that you have to have for your kids to be able to notice those moments. But it's again, a reflection of you put God first. And so when you see these things happening in your kids' lives, your closeness to God is telling you, hey, this is a moment where you have something to give them that they might not already have. And I know your kids, so I can say confidently that I think that has worked for your children. Not to brag about them to you or give you a big head
definitely
or anything,
are not
I like
perfect.
them.
Your kids are hard. Your kids see you like they see me in the morning when I'm like, don't talk to me. I am not a morning person, you know, or when I'm hungry or tired and I'm like, what? You know, I mean, they see us at our worst as well. And so, like I said, it's not for the faint of heart, but I hope that overall we've been able to show our kids that we do rely on God. We do make it important to spend time with him, and that he has carried us through not just that, but a lot of other dark times that they've seen, you know, firsthand as well. So
awesome. Well, thank you for doing this. It's been a pleasure. I'm glad that I met your daughter, and so I get to know you guys too. We will be back next week with our last video for this series and our last video for a while. So I would encourage you to come back and hang out with us next week too.